Thank you for coming for this 76th economic panel of the Economic Policy Review. So we are very happy to have welcoming remarks by Carsten Pillath, with Secretary of State from the Ministry of Finance. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. So hello, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I am Carsten Pillath. I'm the State Secretary in charge of financial markets and international policy in the Federal Ministry of Finance. I'm happy to see you all here today and to be able to welcome you to the ministry, and I'm excited about your presence and looking forward to your presentations. This conference has been a long time in the making. It was supposed to happen in the second half of 2020 as part of the German presidency of the Council of the European Union. Like a lot of things in 2020, it did not happen, but I'm glad that it does today. And that even though the Council presidency has moved to the Czech Republic, I can say from this position, I'm happy that it moved to the Czech Republic. If I were still in the Council Secretariat, I would have to be busy with the Czech Republic right now and advise them how to deal with the European Council that's going to happen today. So we can still meet here in Berlin, and that makes everybody glad. I'm also glad to be able to welcome such a top-class circle of scientists, policy advisors, and government officials. I'm happy to see again Ricardo Reis here among us from the London School of Economics, and I'm looking forward for his keynote and thinking on inflation in the Eurozone. And from a personal perspective, I could add, he impressed already lots of finance ministers and central bankers when he presented his views in the Petersburg G7 meeting in May, and I'm looking forward to listen to him again today. I'm also welcoming from the French Treasury's Chief Economist Agnès Benassi-Quéré, from Oxford, Federica Romei, and Olivier Blanchard from the MIT and IMF's Chief Economist from 2008 to 2015, and last but not least, from our ministry, Wolf Heinrich Reuter, who is sitting far on the left side. Welcome, Wolf. And all of you, of course, presenting, hopefully discussing and listening. Those who have traveled far from near, welcome. I'm happy to see you here. Last but not least, I'm especially grateful to the CEPR team for organizing the conference, and Clemens Fuest for his advice and for making the contact. Thanks, Clemens. So we've got a lot to discuss here. Our current challenges are enormous. We are in a crisis mode, and I feel tempted to tell about the German policy approach, but I will refrain from this because I still have fresh memories being back from Washington, 4 intense days basically of discussion and presentations. And I'd like to share with you a couple of topics. I will only name the brands basically and share with you the questions that were behind this. So one, of course, the overall topic in Washington was Russia, Russia, and Russia. And the consequence of Russia, basically one of the most important ones, was inflation, and the question how best address inflation, the inflation problem right now we are facing. Of course, it's not only related to inflation per se in an abstract way. Behind inflation, we had lots of discussions about energy policy, and this is particularly important for Germany because our model basically rested on cheap energy, and it was the German model. We had a lot of questions in Washington where people asked us, what's the future model of Germany? So I have to say, we do not have the complete answer yet. So we'll be listening to researchers and academics to give us and to help us to find out what this future brings. So apart from this, the big elephant in the room, Washington, was China. It wasn't mentioned, but everybody could feel what it's all about. We had discussions about the wide-scale lockdowns, the impact of lockdowns. It was a little bit the repetition of the April discussion, but in a different environment. Stagflation was one of the big issues. And let's say the fiscal policy, in a certain sense here, was quite heavily addressed in many, many meetings. The overall topic in the fiscal policy issue was not in an abstract way policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy. It was the 3 T's that were the way discussing. I think it doesn't tell anything to most of you, but it's related to inflation, to energy, to fiscal policy. The 3 T's are the mantra mentioned by almost every minister in the meeting. It's about compensation politics in a timely, temporary, and targeted way. That's easy to say. Everybody repeats this mantra, but only one central bank governor raised the question, what does that mean in concrete terms? So there was a discussion about, do we know best practices? Can we agree on the same policy approach? And it was far more pragmatic than any other discussion before, because it took us a while to find out the 3 T's per se, but not fulfilling them with real substance. And the substance discussion has started. The other issue that basically was very impressive for many ministers was a presentation given by the deputy managing director in the IMF about the new balance in member states of the IMF, and everybody asked, what is this balance? What does it mean, the balance? And she pointed in particular out the issue that each member state is looking for a new balance between economic efficiency and security in a wide sense. It was a very interesting observation made by her, and that basically affects many, many member states of the IMF, that she criticized the fact that the pillars in each member state that deals with security in a broad sense, food security, energy security, military security, is not well connected to the efficiency branch. And she recommended to almost every member state, get your people in touch with each other, because you have to find out a new balance. And the new balance may not perfectly fit into the world landscape, because there may be differences in this kind of balance between economic efficiency and security. So it's basically the start of a discussion here in member states, I'm sure in the IMF, that we have a follow-up in the next annual meeting beginning next year. And the final issue, which triggered a very interesting debate, was what I heard the first time ever. You may know this topic better than I do. It was the runaway fragmentation. The runaway fragmentation was a big concern for the IMF, and it goes far beyond what they mentioned, what we think is the main driver, geopolitics right now, energy policy. It would cover, in the view of the IMF, also the whole regulation issue, environmental policy, climate clubs, so all these things. So in a very broad sense, the runaway fragmentation is a big concern for the IMF. And we were looking not for perfect answers, but at least for responses from ministers to this kind of issue. So I just mentioned a few topics here, but the overall approach is quite clear. In designing our policy responses to these challenges, the exchanges and discussions that we have with academia and research are very valuable for us. And that's the reason why I'm so happy to welcome you today here. Economics and economic advice is at the heart of what we do here in the Ministry of Finance, and at the heart of our response to the challenges we are facing. So I hope to hear some of the answers. You may not address all the questions that I have mentioned, but nevertheless, you have a broad range of topics on the agenda. I'm looking forward to this. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over right now for the first presenter, Felipe Valencia Caicedo from the University of British Columbia, who will talk on the legacies of war for post-Ukraine conflict. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed. I only can encourage you to listen and to discuss in particular. And then we'll see where we'll be tomorrow afternoon and what kind of answers I can report back to Minister Lindner, who basically gives his greetings to this event today. Unfortunately, he can't make it, but he would be happy to listen to this. It's not the first exercise where he has invited and listened to economists. I think he's going to continue with this. Unfortunately, today he couldn't make it. Thank you very much and good luck. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your welcoming address. And we hope we are going to shed some light on some interesting issues. So before starting, let me remind you the way we are going to work as usual. So his presentation is 20 minutes, and then there are two discussants speaking for 15 minutes. Then after we have the discussion, so during the discussion, please tell your name before starting so that we can take notes and then indicate in the journal who has made the remarks. And also we want to welcome a new panelist, Katja Kaufmann from Beirut University. And so welcome to Katja. So now we can start with this first paper on Ukraine. And so Felipe, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philippe. Thank you everyone for being here and for the invitation. Not only to have us in the panel, but as an opportunity to talk about Ukraine. This is joint work with Ellen Monroe from the LSE, who's here, Anastasia Nosak, Ukrainian in Statistics Canada, Moises Pedroso in the University of Paraguay, Leonora Guarneri at Exeter, Juan Felipe Riaño at Stanford, Anna Tur-Prats at UC Merced, and myself. Some of them would be also in the Zoom. So what we tried to do in this piece was to think about the historical legacies in conflict. So it's going to be quite a bit of a literature review in some sense, but also to give you a sense of the work that we're doing on some of these obviously important topics and tied to Ukraine. So I guess the question is a simple one, which is what are the long-term legacies of conflict? Let me make this smaller. So we all know how destructive conflict can be in the short term. The question is, what about the long term? So I'm going to first present you the existing consensus in the literature. Then we're going to go kind of by topic. So the impact of bombing, political repression, forced migration, gender and sexual violence, which have been topics that we've also worked in different contexts. So like, what can we learn from these other like lessons from other contexts? And then we're gonna show you, if there's time, a little bit of an empirical analysis of the current conflict, and we're gonna close with some policy lessons. So the idea here is how there are historical, there's a good conflict historical literature, and how can we learn about that in the current Ukrainian context. So if you try to answer this question, what are the long-term impact of conflict, and the answer is not much, or the classic answer was not much. If you read the classic Davis and Weinstein AR 2002 paper, by now I guess an old paper, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the context of World War II, the message is of urban recovery. So you bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, probably the worst things that you could do in humankind, and then you see how there is kind of like going back to normal in terms of demographics, in terms of urban structures. Because we're in Berlin, if you read Brackman et al. In the Journal of Economic Geography, the answer is very much the same. There is a post-war urban recovery after bombing. It was a little bit faster for the West than for the East, but it's still very much this post-war recovery message in terms of demographics, in terms of urban structures. In a more developing country context, if you think about Vietnam, which is one of the heaviest bombed countries in an international setting, in a per capita basis at least, there's now a classic article by Ted Miguel and Gerard Roland that says the same thing. So little to no long-term impact of the US bombing of Vietnam. It's a bit of a more modern paper, 10 years after the first wave. So they use an IV, which is the 17th parallel. Like you can see how obviously like there was the division between North and South Vietnam. So it's an quote unquote identified paper that has essentially the same answer, which is not much in terms of development, not much in terms of population density, income, etc. So with that in mind, that was kind of like the literature when we started getting into these questions. We looked at different contexts, or we looked at more disaggregated data, more modern empirical methods, and to be honest, also different topics. Like maybe you don't care only about urban recovery, but you care about welfare, mental illness, etc. So I want to show you a little bit of that research, like showcase that research, again, taking kind of as departure point this brief introduction. So one is a neighbor of Vietnam, which is Laos. This is a joint project with Juan Felipe Riaño at Stanford. And it was a very simple question, essentially the same one that we were asking before, and is what could be the potential long-term impact of bombing? And here you see a map of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula in terms of nightlights, which is widely used as for economic performance, and bombing events from the US bombing campaigns from 65 to 73, actually 74, we don't have 1 year. And you just do a scatter plot of these things and you find more bombs, less lights, more bombs, less income. And obviously the paper, has a lot in terms of identification and is this causal or not, but this gives you the main message. And one interesting thing that comes from the Laotian context is the focus on UXOs. So it's not only like when you bomb a place and the war is over, the legacies of war are over. Very much not the case in Laos. Thankfully, it's not the case in. It was the case in Berlin. There was a lot of cleaning of the mines, but in Laos you can see how the country is plagued with UXO accidents, and this obviously affects mostly civilians and especially children. So you essentially see a one-to-one relationship after the bombing of Laos of UXO accidents. So this was obviously very strong during the 50s and during the 60s and the 70s, but it's still very much present today. So one of the ways through which conflict could have a long-term economic performance, negative one, of course, is through UXOs. And we go a bit more into the economics of that. And what we see is that papers that were bombed historically, when the kids were in 64 of school age, they receive less human capital. So that's like the historical graph that you see on the left. And then those are kind of like the same cohorts that if you track them over time are stuck more in agriculture as opposed to manufacturing and services. So you see it's kind of like a clean way to see how it's not only conflict, but it could be a human capital shock that perpetuates itself through the labor market, so that today, even though the war is obviously over, Laos is still suffering this. So this is known, there are many ways of this, but in a way it talks to the conflict trap literature of Collier and co-authors. In a very different context, more, I guess, a developed context, but more into the past, we look at the Spanish Civil War with Ana Tur-Prats. And this is a map of the mass graves of the Spanish Civil War. So essentially Spain is one big mass grave from the war, but there's also variation, very specific variation of some areas that were hit harder than others in terms of conflict intensity. And what we see there, we use, again, some identification strategy of routes going to Madrid. And anyways, I'm not going to go into the details of the paper, but we see how even though, of course, the Spanish Civil War is very much over, you can still see a longer term effect in terms of destruction of trust. So there is also a literature of maybe war could foster cooperation, but what we find here in terms of civil war is exactly the opposite. A war that happened long ago could still have significant negative effects and impacts on trust, and we think that trust is important for long-term growth. And that's more the cultural aspect. On the more political aspect, we find also long-term effects. So we zoom into the Aragon region, which would be around here. And this is the map. And the idea here is that there's troops coming from two sides and they're kind of stuck in a type of trench warfare, not very different from World War I. And what we can trace is that areas that were occupied by one force, here I'm just showing the figure of being occupied by the Republican forces in the past, are today also areas where people vote more for the left. And again, this is a paper, so we want to make sure that these things are causal, not just correlational, but there is definitely a long-term impact, not only on the cultural side, but also on the political side. And this summer we went to Aragon and did more surveys, tried to see how people feel about Franco, and again, all of these ideas on collective memory of war. So that's just to showcase two cases. And something that it's particularly important that we've been working with Ellen is migration and violence. So by now, and of course, these figures are changing daily and there are approximations, but for here, we're kind of quoting the ones that we feel more comfortable about. We know that there's 7.6 million Ukrainian refugees only in Europe, and 6.2 million internally displaced. So if anything, this is one of the most important parts of the current conflict. And we try to summarize the literature, which is vast. So on refugee selection, especially females, I mean, all refugees, but especially females have lower employment outcomes than the economic migrants. That's documented in the literature. The impact on forced migration, obviously, is usually negative. They fare worse than the indigenous or the native population of the home countries. But it's interesting, and this again is coming from the historical literature, how forced migration is shifting investments towards human capital instead of physical assets. So, for instance, the work of Sasha Becker and co-authors is exactly on this. The impact on the sending regions is usually by consensus negative on growth, trust, education, etc. I mean, obviously, these are war scenarios. And the impact on receiving regions, it's a bit all over the place. I would say kind of like no effect to slight negative effects, but you don't see kind of like the overwhelming negative effect as in sending regions. And what comes also from that literature is how important, like what do you actually do with refugees? Like how are they integrated? So it's very different if they go to industrialized urban centers than if they go to more rural areas. So that's going to be one of the policy points. In the other big thing that emerges from the historical literature are sex ratios and gender. So we have kind of like a whole section of the paper on gender. I had worked before with a set of co-authors I'm going to show you in a second on Paraguay. Again, it's a historical conflict, but I think some of the lessons are long lasting. So during the Triple Alliance War of Paraguay against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, 75 to 90% of men were killed. So we titled the paper "Country of Women." And we see a bunch of things. We see in the shorter term a higher out of wedlock births, kind of illegitimate births. And in the very long term, we also see shifts in female labor force participation. So maybe that's kind of a silver lining for conflict. And we see that also for World War II in France and for World War I. And we see more female education and more equal gender norms. So maybe that's one aspect where conflict could have potentially good impacts, very, very long run in after 100, 150 years. This is just the labor force profile of Ukraine. And again, you can see kind of lower female labor force participation as is usual and some imbalance there. I mean, for Ukraine is very important. As you know, most males were not even allowed to leave. So there's a lot of the migration part that is actually going to be female and kids. And this is just to give you one slide of that paper. So we see in the 1873 census that cohorts that are affected by war, and there will be areas nationally where there could even be 3.5 females per male in this conflict. And there is interesting regional variation. So in some areas, there could be 7 females per male during the conflict. And of course, the sex ratio goes back to parity right after the conflict. One topic where my co-author Anna Tur-Prats and Eleonora Guarneri are experts is conflict-related sexual violence. So there have been episodes, and probably these are under-reportings already in the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It's obviously a brutal form of violence. So by June 2022, we already had 14 reports. You can see them here in the map. And again, it's important to stress in this literature that under-reporting is a huge issue. In their paper, Anna and Eleonora find or try to look at the deeper roots of this problem, and they center in Africa and African and inter-ethnic conflict in particular. So there they find that patriarchal norms are very much related to sexual violence, and the cultural distance between different groups that are in conflict is important to determine these things. So here you just see kind of like from their paper where Russians and Ukrainians would be ethnically. So in that way, I mean, kind of like there's a small validation of their paper, which again, I encourage you to read. It's not forthcoming at the QJE. Then let me in the remaining 5 minutes, just to keep track of time, tell you a little bit of what we found more on Ukraine proper. So this is daily violence in Ukraine over time. Here we stopped in August 30th, 2022. Obviously a massive decline. I mean, I guess you've been following the news. So it's mostly driven by the east and northern regions. There's a little bit of an increase in the south. And as you know, it's an all-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine. Almost 5,000, almost 6,000 civilians have died. and 9,000 have been injured. Of course, these are undercounts, and this is one of the things that we also learned from conflict and from the conflict literature, like how eventually you get some of the consensus numbers, and also from the Russian side, like, I mean, the numbers are a bit all over the place. This is just to give you a sense of Russian territorial control over time. Here, we're just stopped in June 30th, but you can see kind of like from the beginning of the invasion, how it has shifted to Ukrainian control, as we've seen in the media reports. And these are things that are more correlates of conflict. So first, it was very interesting, and there's a whole literature and political science. People like Rosenas and Lupo and Peishakin have studied this topic in the context of Ukraine, of conflict and political violence and repression and political participation. So just from the political side, we see a massive decline in pro-Russian votes in Ukraine. And this is all over, like in all regions, this was going on up until 2015. And we see also an interesting correlation. I mean, obviously nothing causal here, between political participation and lower conflict. So that's kind of like one of the correlates that we find. And going further back in time, we find a very significant correlation between ethnic Russian population in the 1926 Soviet census. And obviously, this was part of the USSR back then. I mean, of the Empire of Russia, and eventually under Stalin and the USSR. And obviously, I mean, this is one thing that you see nowadays. This is most probably working through modern ethnic populations, but you do see that areas that are more ethnically Russian are the ones that have been attacked recently. And just to give you one example of ethnic and political repression, this Holodomor famine, which is probably the most important political repression case in the history of Ukraine, under Stalin, we see a negative correlation between these two. And again, kind of the explanation is through the ethnic side, because now we know that mostly Ukrainians were targeted. So you can like see in the maps kind of like this relationship between, or in this case, lack of relationship between the two. So let me just make sure that we conclude in time. So first, an acknowledgement that there are obviously many other topics in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict that are important and that we're not addressing here. Things that are a bit more modern, like sanctions. There's a very nice paper out of the LSE last year on these. Trade, there's a forthcoming AR paper by Alexei Makarin and Korovkin, and they're also working now on trade. There are papers, but actually not a lot in economics on nuclear threat. So I guess the best paper was the impact of the Chernobyl disaster in Sweden. So there are other topics that are clearly not in this survey. But what do we learn with that caveat? So one, the importance of a demining agenda in a post-conflict scenario. Two, that there's not only kind of like that part of economic outcomes, but if you think more about social cohesion, trust, and political participation, these are also affected and are important. The whole issue of collective memory, like how do you build a retelling of the war? And refugee integration matters. I mean, kind of the literature is saying that they should go to the most promising labor markets. Obviously, this could be very hard politically. So we're also aware of the political constraints. But things like human capital and training programs, especially for the most vulnerable population, women and children, to mitigate the negative impact of sex ratios. Obviously, like we don't want some of the negative outcomes, but there could be some positive ones. So there's some change that we can see, at least in the Paraguayan society after 150 years. So some of these things could actually be positive. And in terms of sexual violence, prosecution of crimes, I mean, it's kind of an obvious one, but also better reporting of a crime that is usually misreported, and a way to provide full assistance to the victim. So in the remaining 10 seconds, I would say that kind of we are also rethinking this older consensus, the one that I started with in terms of conflict, with more disaggregated data, mechanisms, and new outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this very enlightening survey. So, which is going to be discussed online by Torsten Roga. So Torsten, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Can you all see me and hear me? See my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Felipe, for a great presentation and a great paper. So I'm Torsten. I'm currently at Uppsala University. So before I give a few comments, let me just give you a quick overview to put this into perspective. So in recent years, as Felipe has already said, there's a number of studies on conflict in economics. So before I think 2010, conflict was never really so much on the agenda of economists, but with the survey paper in the Journal of Economic Literature by Blattman and Miguel, it really exploded. And since then, there's a new paper on conflict every day, it seems. And actually, that survey paper got me thinking about conflict in the first place. So this paper, Felipe's paper and co-authors, provides a great review of the summary of the existing literature on the effects of conflict, but then goes one step further and uses those insights from the consensus, because now there's a huge literature on this, to formulate predictions about the war in Ukraine. What can we expect, and how can potential solutions looks like? And then finally, they also, as Felipe said, provide some correlations on potential drivers of conflict, and I'll address those or have a few comments on those in just a second. So what do I think of this? I think this is a great idea to use those robust findings in the literature to predict outcomes for Ukraine. In a sense, that's why I'm writing all these papers. Finally, someone's using them. It's obviously interesting. It's extremely important. I mean, you just have to pick up any newspaper. The invasion has lasted for 230 days. I just set 239 days. I just checked in The Guardian. It's obviously on everybody's agenda. And so this is a very useful paper. I agree with the author's suggestions 100%, especially regarding the condemnation of sexual violence against women and children. And finally, and this is something that I care a lot about, it's very well written. So thank you very much. It was very interesting to read. Okay, so what do I think? So let's start with the Holodomor famine. Now this is coming from the paper, from the version that I read. I think it would be useful for the reader if you give a bit more background on what that famine actually was. You mentioned it in the presentation, the man-made famine under Joseph Stalin to prevent Ukrainian independence movements, massive, and then given that, what do we expect for conflict in Ukraine? And so in the paper, you say that opposition is stronger in those places, but there are fewer war events. First of all, so how do you measure opposition? And at the same time, these places have historically more Russians. I thought there was less opposition in places with Russians. Also, that mechanism could be something that you can check, given that you have data on, historical data on how many Russians there are in these counties. And so that would be something that I think you could sharpen up a bit, but it's an easy fix. Getting back to your second point, the ethnic Russians, you argue that there are more violent events in places with many Russians. And so the picture on the right here comes from your paper. And so I was wondering if there is any evidence that the local Russian population is actually helping the Russian army. And so the reason I'm bringing this up, and I'll take you to a first digression, the Rwandan genocide. So I don't know if you guys know about it, probably, but maybe not the details. In 1994, in Rwanda, a small landlocked country in Eastern Africa, the Hutu majority, one ethnic group, killed big parts of the Tutsi minority in just about 100 days. And after those 100 days, some 800,000 people lost their lives, and there was massive participation by ordinary civilians, people like you and me, who picked up machetes, picked up clubs, and went and killed their neighbors. And there's work by this guy who shows that the Hutu army, Hutu militia, incited civilians to actually participate in the genocide. So to give you some numbers, So you have the effect. So for every militiaman sent into a village, 7 more civilians participate. And if you do the math, those 50,000 army and militiamen that were sent around the entire country were responsible for at least 85 to 90% of the killings, both directly by killing themselves and indirectly by getting civilians to do so. Okay. And so in the paper argue that if one had stopped those army and militiamen from spreading, the genocide could have been prevented. And that is exactly what Romeo Dallaire, I don't know if you remember this face, Romeo Dallaire, who was the UN commander in Kigali at the time, I think back in the day you faxed. So he faxed to Kofi Annan in New York, give me 5,000, 8,000 well-equipped troops and I'll stop the genocide. That paper proves that he was right. So back to the ethnic Russians, I had a look at the ACLED data that you're using. And of course, the Russian army shows up as an actor and the Ukrainian army shows up and a bunch of other ones, but there are not so many. But one army or militia group that consistently shows up are the pro-Russian separatists. And so I thought it might be interesting to see whether those are complements to the Russian army, or whether they're substitutes. Are there any interesting interaction effects that are going on? So that might be something that you check in the data. What is probably more difficult, possible to check in the data is this actually happening with civilians as well? But maybe there's anecdotal evidence that you could add, because as soon as these things happen, wars can blow up tremendously. And there's one other thing that happens, and that takes me to my second digression. It's again on the genocide, again on the Rwandan genocide. During the Rwandan genocide, there were 2 main types of perpetrators. There were the army and militiamen on one hand, these guys to the left. Those were the guys with machine guns and grenades. Their violence led to a lot of physical destruction. They targeted predominantly adult men. I'll tell you why in a second. And in these villages that had a lot of that type of violence, women take over. Okay. The other type of violence are local perpetrators, people like me. Local killers that use their machete or their club, low technology weapons, led to very little capital destruction. And these guys targeted particularly women and children. In these villages that experienced a lot of local violence, men stay in power. So why would you target adult men? Well, because army militiamen were the ones with machine guns and grenade, firearms, bullets. If bullets are in short supply, you want to kill as many people as possible, you'd use them on adult men because they're likely to escape or fight back. And simultaneously, if you want to target women or children, it would be more easy to do this relatively with a club or a machete. Okay. So the strategic choice, different types of perpetrators targeted very different subpopulations, and the outcomes differ dramatically. And we have exogenous, I should add this because I'm talking to a bunch of economists. We have exogenous variation in both of them. So 2 instruments, I'm not going to go into the details, but 2 instruments that give you variation in army men, give you variation in local killers. Okay. And if you then look at the outcomes in places that are led by men, so places that had a lot of local killers where the women were targeted with low technology weapons, these places are initially richer. And that's the Malthusian channel at play. So you kill people, but there's very little capital destruction because the killing happens with a machete. These places are initially richer, but only temporarily, because eventually the people are replaced. Okay. In women-led villages, those villages are initially poorer. Remember, they were targeted by army militiamen, used grenades and firearms. That led to physical distraction. They were also coming from outside of the village, and so they looted a lot. These places are initially poor, but eventually catch up. And the argument we make is that women take over as household heads and politicians. We can show that in the data. There's more public goods provision, local public goods provision. We can show that in the data. These places are more peaceful. and overall female empowerment improves. You can give me any indicator you want from the DHS. Women do better in these places 15, 20 years after the genocide. Okay. And so depending on who you're faced, it can lead to very different outcomes. I just want to give you one example here regarding the peacefulness. So pink are the villages for women in power, blue for men in power. And I'm having on the y-axis post-genocide political violence using the same data as Felipe does, so ACLA data. And then here the time frame, so right after the genocide. The data starts in 1999, unfortunately. It doesn't go back to 1994, up to today. And you see that these villages diverge. So in places where women are in power, these places are more peaceful. And the opposite is true in villages where men are in power. And so what's the takeaway for Ukraine, potentially? Depending on the type of perpetrator and their targets, so is it the external army or militia? Is it the external Russian army? Is it local militia? Is it other militias? So again, I looked at the ACLA data. There's a lot of other actors. The effects might differ. And so knowing which region gets targeted by who, how, and when is another potentially important part or puzzle piece for post-conflict reconstruction. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this discussion. So the next discussion is Roman, sorry, America.
Thank you so much. Today I'm standing in two roles. One is an academic professor of Case Western Reserve University, United States, but also another role, I'm a Ukrainian. And I was in Kyiv one day before Russia started bombing the city. I was opening up a university, American University Kyiv, as a founding rector or chancellor of the university. But of course I had to leave. We postponed our opening until September, and now we have our first cohort of students, 152 students, and in January I'll be going back to Ukraine full-time again. So it's a very personal topic for me, obviously, and I want to thank the committee and everybody who is here for bringing it up, because again, for me, it's more than just a research agenda, because I do study conflict and war as a behavioral economist, but it's also the survival of my mom, dad, my brother, and my countrymen. So that being said, this brings me to a really nice overview. I really appreciated the paper. It was very well written. There are a lot of things that I like, and there's going to be some constructive criticisms that it is in academia, and I want to bring some of these points up. So in general, when you read through this policy paper, the way that it's built is the sections are very well organized, especially the first three sections. They start with the topic, review of the literature, and then there is policy implications. And it's very nicely written. That's why it's very easy to read as you go through those first three sections. Then section 5 does some of analysis of the conflict using some we'll talk about this. We'll have a detailed discussion there, but there is some disconnect between section 5 and the sections 2 through 4, because the first three are really tightly oriented on policy, and then you jump as if it was almost a different paper. So for the authors, if you can create a better connect between those sections, it seemed to me somewhat disconnected. In section 6, again, there is these bits of pieces that kind of inserted, exposed. It's like, sometimes when you write a paper and there's a referee says, oh, and mention this one, you have footnote 157, and so that's how it felt, especially the paragraph that discusses about the trade disruption, international sanctions, and nuclear war. It's really, for me, it reads really out of place. Plus, international sanctions have nothing to do with Ukraine. It's about on the impact of sanctions on Russia. So it's, again, think of how to maybe better position that. Also, I am going to be very critical on this point. It's you use the term Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It's incorrect. It is a Russian war against Ukraine, and it's I would ask and request you to change that. First of all, it's if you read the historical literature, how the history people right now, we had 3 conferences already on this topic, and pretty much unanimously we had corrected, multiple presentations that people were using conflict. Timothy Snyder is a renowned historian, distinguished professor at Yale. He uses the term Russo-Ukrainian war. Also, if you look at the correct definition of the project, the Correlates of War project, it says that the war is a sustained combat involving organized armed forces, resulting in a minimum of 1,000 battle-related fatalities within a 12-month period. We have way more than that. And me and Eric Kimbrough, we have a review that we published. I was editing a special issue on the theories of conflict and war in economics. And we have actually different disciplines that have looked at this issue from different perspectives. And again, by pretty much any definition, this is a war. And finally, the language of Russian-Ukrainian conflict, quote unquote, is first of all misleading because it puts the aggression on both sides, and then it is simply offensive to Ukrainians. So I would request you to change that. That's an important, both academically and for me personally. Now, going now through sections 2, 3, and 4. Sections 2, 3, and 4 are very well written. I really like them. They highlight different pieces of the literature, and they talk about, what do we know from the studies, and then the policy suggestion at the end. So one of the things that I found a little bit troubling in section 2, specifically, that's about the impact of conflict on economic development, long-term economic development. There was disconnect between the studies that you mentioned and the particular Ukrainian situation, because, for example, if you look at the bombing of Afghanistan, it's very different than the bombing of that Russia is doing today in Ukraine. They're targeting specifically not military targets, but civilian infrastructure. 30% of electricity is gone today in Ukraine. 30%. Right now, as we speak, my parents have no electricity. And it's targeted, and it will be continued to target. So it's a very different type of bombing. So it's very important to recognize which conflicts are going to be more likely tied in and closely related to Ukraine, and then bring the policy implications tied to those conflicts. Now, section 2, again, when you talk about the culture and politics, I really like that connect. There was a really nice literature and a very nice connection to the policy implications. Now, one of the things that I thought that you did not highlight as one of your key policy implications, but I thought it was so important, and that is the problem of polarization, because I see it right now, being from the Western Ukraine and seeing how the refugees, even from the Eastern Ukraine, moving today to the Western Ukraine, there's a lot of polarization. People are very tense because the people in the West feel that the people in the East have allowed and welcomed this conflict in the first place. And this polarization is going to be one of the key problems in Ukrainian society, even though on the one hand, they're going to be less pro-Russian, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of polarization because of this conflict. So if you could bring that issue as one of the important topics and the policy pieces that should be addressed. And what is the role of propaganda in this? Because again, one of the things that we know about propaganda, it doesn't change as much the people's opinion, but it polarizes the society. That's really, when you read the literature and propaganda, that is what it's all about. And so that polarization piece was, I would highlight it more. The section 3 on migration, again, very nicely written, very clear connection there. Now, some suggestions that I have, when improving access to education for women may not be such an issue for Ukrainian women, as you bring from the literature, because Ukrainian overall, if you look at the Ukrainian women, it would be really nice to get the data and compare, what's the average literacy rate of these women and that have immigrated or migrated as refugees to Germany, for example? What is their general average education level? And I think those numbers may surprise you. So again, it's a nice policy implication. I like it. Of course, we should highlight the education piece, but at the same time, I think it may not be as important given that the high literacy rate within Ukraine. And one thing that I really was missing from this section is the highlighting the importance of bringing refugees back to Ukraine. You talk quite a few times in the paper about the importance of human capital in rebuilding Ukraine, in rebuilding the country that has been in the state of war. Well, that's one of the pieces. We have 7 million refugees that need to get back to Ukraine. And what are the policies that would ensure that that's going to happen? So that was a missing part for me. Impact of conflict on women, very important topic. Sexual violence, very important topic. The 4-year-old girl has been raped by Russians. 4-year-old girl. That's a documented state. I was yesterday. I was in D.C. and I was talking to the office of the general prosecutor of the United States. They are opening a case of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine and at the American University Kyiv. And we're going to be collaborating, collecting this evidence for these war crimes. This is super important topic, and I'm really glad that you guys are highlighting this. But again, unlike other sections, I see there's not as much connection to the policies. Okay, we should know about sexual violence. That's good, but I want to know what are the actual policies that can be implemented, in terms, maybe it would be for all the countries to open the prosecution office and finding these war crimes and making sure that those crimes that have been committed, that they will be followed upon, and then those people will face justice, because they will never be able to be the part of the world unless they amend for their crimes. Finally, the last section here, and this is the section on empirical analysis of war. You mentioned some figures, and I understand you quote Forbes and a couple other outlets. I would like for you to be a little bit more inclusive in terms of sources, because there is actually much more sources, and the numbers are quite different. You have to understand that, and it's definitely an lower bound. If you look at those numbers, I mean, I gave you some references. You can find at least 5 more sources where you can collect this data, including the official sources from Ukrainian side. You can even use whatever Russians are saying with a grain, of course, of huge grain of salt. But again, it would be good to quote the ranges of civilians instead of particular point estimates, because it doesn't cover the whole picture here. Again, maybe including also military losses of Russia. It's a part of the war casualties as well. So we know the total number there. You define, there is a definition of violent events when you make the analysis. I mean, I couldn't find the definition. What is a violent event? So it'd be good to at least explain what you mean by the violent event. The gunshot has been fired, the rocket that has been hit, the civil casualty. What is the violent event? It would be good to give a definition. And also for the correlation analysis that you use, you have 2 specific correlates, and very good ones: ethnic identity and Holodomor famine. And both of these are very important. I do believe that there is some causality there. Of course, very difficult will be to parse it out. But one of the the discussant before me also pointed out something very interesting, and that's the sort of the separatist movement and that part. But then the fourth one that I would like to point out is the Russian language itself. It's been cited as it's most commonly cited reasons for war by Russians. So if you talk about Russian people, why are you there in Ukraine? They will citing, well, we are defending Russian-speaking people. And there is a difference between ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking Ukrainian. So that's a very different, a number. and the very different correlates. So if you could do maybe that analysis, that would be very, very helpful. And finally, this is, I'm at the end of my presentation. I wanted to just to honor Ukrainian people. I wanted to show that this is not just the numbers, right? Because we can get lost in these numbers. These are the statistics. When you have thousands of people that are dead, that's statistics, but it's individual lives. It's somebody on the line. And this is a mall right here where I was in Kiev literally 1 week before Russia started bombing Kiev. I was in this place. Could have been one of the victims there. And of course, it's the people. It's the people that suffer the most. And so I really appreciate that you guys raised this topic. Thank you for bringing me and for putting this as a part of the policy proposal and policy discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roman, for this testimony and the discussion. So now we are going to ask questions to the panel discussion. So please move your sign this way. And also, the signs are very small. I don't know all the names, so I will show you with finger sometimes. Sorry for that. Yes, so yeah, I said it again. Yeah, we say it again. It's very important that you say your name, especially since I don't see you necessarily your name when I don't know you. So Kevin O'Rourke, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kevin O'Rourke. So if I were thinking about the long run economic implications for Ukraine of the war in Ukraine, I probably would have put the implications for institutional change almost at the top of the list, because it seems to me first order important, what happens to economic and political institutions and integration with Europe. And those two things obviously go together, which is why becoming a member state of the European Union is a machine for getting rich, because it's a way of overcoming all of those obstacles to institutional change within your own country. And I think that history probably would make you optimistic here. So when you have populations who have fought in a total war for a long time and have suffered as much as the Ukrainians have, and then it becomes impossible to not give the people what they want. So we saw that in 1918 in Europe. Country after country became democratic. The elites had to give people the vote. They couldn't stand in their way. In 1945, the Brits have to give ordinary people the National Health Service, even if that means getting rid of Churchill. So it strikes me that, since there is this huge appetite for institutional change within Ukraine on the one hand, and on the other hand, the whole casus belli was the right of that country to choose its own future, and that means the EU, we think, and that requires institutional change. That strikes me as the most important consideration, really. There probably is so is there in general a literature on war and institutional reform? It might be a question. Mansur Olsen had arguments about this, but that was more in the context of countries that have been totally defeated, which is not going to be the case here.
Thank you, Kevin. Moritz?
Thank you, Moritz Schullerich, Sciences Po Paris and University of Bonn. I have a similar vein to what Kevin just said. We have a similar debate about the consequences of conflict and war when we look at distributional trends over the long run. So there is an argument out there that the only time that Western economies have seen really significant shifts in the income and wealth distribution was around the world wars. And it's something that you don't talk about in the paper right now, but I'd be interested if there is a more broad, first of all, is there any evidence, or are you aware of any evidence that wars systematically trigger policy reactions that, or through whatever channels, I want to say, lead to redistribution of income and wealth, and possibly, I'm thinking about the Ukrainian situation. Is that could that mesh with what Kevin just said, sort of getting the Ukraine into a more sort of Western European context, also in terms of social indicators, distribution and inequality?
Please.
Hi, I'm Michael Gasharek from University of Sussex. I'm a trade economist, so this is not an area that I know anything about. I found it absolutely fascinating, very interesting, and it made me want to go away and read the paper at some point. I have a comment and a question. My comment is, it seems it's clearly the case that conflicts vary enormously in what drives them, in how they are enacted, and so on, and therefore the consequences. And it seems to me quite a heroic task to try and draw general policy conclusions from that. You know, I applaud you for trying to do so, but I think it's really, really hard. I mean, I kind of struggle to think, you know, how relevant is the experience of the Spanish Civil War to, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, and to try and draw policy conclusions from that, I think is very, very difficult. So that's my comment. One area or issue where perhaps it is, it may be easier to try and draw conclusions and policy conclusions, which is perhaps a slightly less discussion, but which you mentioned in your presentation, is to do with the impacts of migration. And here you can think about the impacts either on the migrants themselves or on the receiving region. And I don't know anything about this literature, as I said a minute ago, but my question here is how much work there has been, or is there any work, do you discuss this on the impact both on the migrants and on the receiving region of the role of historical and cultural, I guess, similarity between the migrants and the region in which they are migrating to? What I have in mind here, for example, is that a large part of parts of the western part of Ukraine were actually part of Poland in 1939. And the relationship between Poland and Ukraine was somewhat mixed, as it were. And you know, what are there differences between the way migrants are received, the outcomes for migrants and for the receiving region, for example, in the regions that were previously part of Poland in comparison to those that weren't, and so on? And is there any work that explores those sorts of issues? It seems to me there's potentially something interesting to be done there.
Thank you. Please.
Niklas Heusch from the Finance Ministry here in the Fiscal Policy Division. Thanks a lot from me too. I had two questions. The first one is on other outcomes, kind of both figuratively and literally. Kind of what about if the war ends, but you're not back to the status quo? I think you had Vietnam or Laos, but what happens if you end up with occupation to nightlights or to the outcomes there? And the other one, what about kind of the people who died or the ones who stayed behind? Kind of for more recent conflicts, is there anything you can say about psychological costs, like on a microeconomic level, but looking at the Gallup poll or other outcomes? And my second question actually was, what about the things that kind of historians talk about, kind of where microeconomists or where we struggle because they're so difficult to identify? So in World War II, like, I mean, Berlin's destroyed. You look at nightlights later, they're as bright as before. Cool. But at the same time, the world's kind of global center also shifted from Europe to the US. And there were so many people, if you go to US art museums or look at physicists in the US after the war, they were all born in Europe. They were no longer here. So is there anything that economists kind of could add that historians are not doing, like synthetic control? You had Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I don't know if there was synthetic control. It might be extremely tough to identify, like who would even be your comparison unit. But is there, is there something economists can add to historians, like looking at more macro aggregate outcomes, potentially case studies? Thanks.
Thank you. Ricardo Reis.
Okay. Yes, Ricardo Reis from the LSE. Two questions or comments, which is, number one, can you define a little more clearly what is the counterfactual here? It seems to have that we have a very meritorious pacifist view of the world where it's either we have peace and it's wonderful and Ukrainians and Russians talked in 2014 and we all went each other way, or we have war, and then war is clearly bad. But here, I mean, when we're thinking about the evolution from a conflict that started in Donbass in 2014 or before to the war, to the Russian invasion in 2020, are we talking about the effect of if we didn't have this war in 2022, does that mean we would have instead Russians constantly sabotaging regions in eastern Ukraine, invading constantly? We wouldn't call it a war, but would that be better or would that be worse actually than what we're having right now with this hopefully short-lived conflict or not? What is the counterfactual? I mean, and this applies then to the variety, as just was point of different conflicts. I mean, we fight wars. I tend to think that wars are bad for both sides, but not wholly bad for both sides. I mean, if the alternative was to have my entire population of Ukraine wiped out in 3 days or 3 weeks, then maybe the war actually has a positive effect relative to that. So could you define better what you mean by the impact of a conflict, of a war? Relative to what? I find it hard to interpret the findings of this literature that you summarized in terms of, because very often it's the microgeographic variation, but I'm thinking of war versus non-war is the way it's written. But then that's not really what the studies do. They do a little more war here, or a little less war there in terms of the different regions that get affected. So the counterfactual, I find very hard to interpret what's going on from a scientific economic perspective without understanding what that is. Second question or comment, if I may, just, and here again, all the comments come from the perspectives coming as a modest macroeconomist, just the capital stock. I mean, I would think the first order impact of war is you should destroy K. You focus hugely on the impacts on L, on labor. Kevin already said maybe you should focus a little more also on institutions, on A if you want. But I would think the first order impact of war is to wipe out half of the capital stock. And then we have to rebuild it. The issues having to do with loans, reconstruction, and others, they're completely absent from your paper. And, it's already a long paper, so I don't want to pile up on you. But at least as a macroeconomist, that was absolutely my knee-jerk reaction is section 1 has to be, you've wiped out half the capital stock. The whole solo model tells us what would happen or not. Fine. And you may say, well, we understand that so well that we can talk about these other ones. But that just seems just a very blatant admission, not to talk about the fact that we just wiped out so much of the Ukraine that has to be rebuilt now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we have to stop the question here. Felipe, you have like 6 minutes to answer this bunch of questions.
Yeah, so first of all, thank Thorsten and Roman, especially for all of the comments. Just to say, please send us the slides and happy to incorporate everything with regards to language and the specific points that you had. And we had Anastasia on the group, but I think it's great to have like a Ukraine expert, and we wish we had you in the paper. Let me not answer everything because I think it's going to be hard, but just to say, yes, we can look or discuss more about institutional change, inequality. This recent book by Shadel is also on that. Only wars and plagues could decrease inequality. There's also, you pointed out of what happens with assimilation. I think that's an interesting question of where these people go. There's going to be the obvious indigeneity problem, which is, do you go to Poland exactly because it used to be Ukraine or not? And it's endogenous, but it's not about indigeneity here. But I think it's a very interesting post scenario in the sense of, we know, I'm Colombian in the Venezuelan refugee crisis, like most of them are coming to Colombia. So we see that, and there are now some studies that are starting to look at these things. So happy to see what we can do. Nicholas, yes, mental health, psychology, it's really a massive literature on conflict. So we just wanted to focus on some, but we can obviously discuss this. In terms of occupation, like Nico Voigtlander and Joachim Vogt have this paper on what happens during the denazification campaigns. We are blocks away from the museum that talks about all these things. So yes, there's a bit of a literature in that. Sasha Becker has really cool work also on expellees and migrants and migration. So it's not the macro thing that I think that is the one that you were implying of there is just a change of the center of power being in Europe versus being in the US. But there are some papers that speak to that and how the flourishing of German scientists in the US contributed to Nobel Prize winners there, et cetera, and how bad it was for Germany in this case. Ricardo, that's a bit related. There are all these papers of physical capital and human capital, and maybe it's just that, yes, I guess in this literature, most of it has been we know that capital can be revealed, and some of the longer term papers, which was our focus, are more on human capital. But yes, I mean, step 0 or step 1 is physical capital. But we should make that emphasis. Again, Sasha Becker has a nice paper of like what happens if you destroy physical versus human capital. It should be super present in the agenda, but I think it's kind of obvious. But the fact that it's obvious doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it. So definitely. So thanks everybody. I don't know, Ellen, if you want to add anything.
Oh yeah, so the kind of cultural homogeneity of people getting, you know, when refugees arrive, are they going to interact with the population in a way that is sort of cohesive? So I think some papers say integration matters. This is pretty hard to identify because typically refugees will, if they have a choice, they can elect to go to places that culturally or they already have family there. We don't see, like, nothing jumps out of the page of me of like being a really big part of the literature. So I think this is definitely something that should be explored more.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can go to the next paper, which is about exchange rate and inflation under a weak monetary policy. Refit is yours.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a special pleasure for me to be here. I've been a panelist and an editor at Economic Policy, but never an author, so I'm making up for that now. Despite the title, this is not a paper on Turkey per se. It's a paper on economic policy making and how we think about policy outcomes using our models. Turkey is there because the Turkish economy sadly produces an insane amount of identifying variance and allows us to answer some truly fascinating questions. And to make that point, in conspicuous timing, with inflation at 83% today, 2 hours ago, the Central Bank of Turkey cut interest rates by 150 basis points to 10.5%. And that's the kind of policy that economists want to see for identification purposes, and citizens hate to see because of what they do to them. So we'll talk about that. You might think that we are using the Turkish experiment for 3 reasons. One is, we love the country. The second one is there's so much identifying policy variation that a lot of economists actually find things that are of use to them in terms of answering questions on asset prices, labor markets, investment, firm behavior, whatnot. And the third is, well, our interest, being monetary economists, is we want to understand the effects of monetary policy that is off the charts, likely called interesting. This is a loaded paper. I'm not going to have time to go over every bit of it. And rather than rushing through all of it, I'm going to pick and choose. But what we're going to do is, let's see if I can use this. That's better. Okay. So we're going to begin by saying, look, for all intents and purposes, what we are witnessing in Turkey for more than a decade now, actually, is properly thought of as a neo-Fisherian disinflation experiment. Turkey wanted to lower inflation by keeping the interest rate low, right? And that's the definition of the neo-Fisherian disinflation. Now, we wrote the first draft of this and then realized that we don't actually quite understand how, in theory, this is supposed to work. And then we spent some time and did understand it. So one of the things that is in the paper is a discussion of what exactly is the Fisher effect, what exactly is the neo-Fisher effect, how are the two related, and how are the two related to the new Keynesian model and the indeterminacy that is possible in that model. right? Then we talk about, okay, what exactly was it in the monetary policy experiment in Turkey? And in particular, in what sense do we think of this as exogenous variation? Why isn't it endogenous monetary policy response to something that we would find interesting? And in general, especially people with a neo-Fischerian persuasion, immediately assume that, you know, Turkey would not have done this, you know, these results should not be the outcome of a neo-Fischerian disinflation, and thus something else has to be going on, and the something else would be fiscal theory of the price level, that the monetary policy was supporting fiscal deficits. So we're going to very easily show that that's not the case. Okay, then we're going to say, okay, now one of the things that we are so interested in as macroeconomists is, you know, exchange rates, in particular, our beloved purchasing power parity that the data seems to hate every which way. But we usually test purchasing power parity between pairs of countries, one of which has, you know, 1.8% inflation, the other one has, you know, 2.1% inflation, whatnot, right? So we're going to say, you know, let's try one where the inflation differential is, you know, this big, okay, and then see whether PPP is holding or not, right? And the answer turns out to be, it holds so well, right? And in fact, we can also say we're going to do better than Misi and Rogov. Okay, you can use inflation to forecast inflation, forecast exchange rates better than a random walk. Then there's going to be this song and dance about, but why on earth would a country do this kind of a inane policy? And it's not going to surprise you that that's a general governance problem. Okay, then comes, you know, what got us started in this, which is, so you keep interest rates low, right? And our new Keynesian model says, well, if you're not responding to inflation, you're going to be violating the Taylor principle, okay? And the question becomes, what exactly happens in these models when you violate the Taylor principle? The cheap answer is, of course, indeterminacy. But indeterminacy is too cheap in the sense that I can justify any outcome I observe under indeterminacy. Okay, so we're going to rig the model such that it's going to be kind of locally indeterminate-ish. We're going to call it weak policy, but in a regime switching sense, so that it's going to be globally determinate. But we will be able to say, you know, look, when you're running monetary policy in this lousy way, inflation will be very high. Okay, but better than that, because very high is fine, but you might also end up with very low in that world. Better than that is our sad introduction of an effective upper bound on monetary policy. Okay, and you know, anyone who has studied models with an effective lower bound understand why it's going to be an impediment to fighting against deflation, right? And an effective upper bound works in a symmetric manner. This is not a particularly Turkish problem. In a world where, you know, fiscal deficits are through the roof, governments are finding it difficult to govern. If you haven't paid attention, Liz Truss resigned about half an hour ago, right? So, you know, I'm going to refrain from, you know, ribbing the country that used to be a European Union member until recently, but these things are relevant for countries other than Turkey, right? So we're going to talk about the effective upper bound and what it does to monetary policy making. And then at the very end, both because it's interesting on its own right, but also because, you know, economists like these kinds of, you know, dinner stories. In the fall of 2021, Turkey began to actually cut interest rates as inflation was going up, okay? And so that allows a series of really interesting event studies. So we present those. Okay, so beginning with the neo-Fischerian effect, it begins with the Fisher equation. And the Fisher equation, although we call it an equation, it's an identity. It's the definition of the real exchange rate, okay? And identities are usually crummy places to start for theorizing because there is no theory, it's the definition. Now you go from here and say that definition is also correct at steady state. Thus, at steady state, the nominal interest rate is going to be the sum of the real interest rate plus steady state inflation. Steady state inflation is something like the inflation target, right? But the kicker here, and this is where theory comes in, is at steady state, the real interest rate is going to be exogenous to the monetary policy process. That at steady state, real interest rate will be given by something like the marginal cost of capital, the growth rate of the economy, whatnot. Okay, so you look at this and say, okay, if R bar is exogenous and I bar is lower, then it has to be that pi bar is lower. Right? So that's your Fisher effect. At steady state, lower nominal rates are associated with lower inflation. fine. The neo-Fisherian effect essentially says through a Phillips curve-ish relationship, lower inflation in the future is going to lead to lower inflation now, okay? So that's the neo-Fisherian effect that says it's not only in the long run that lower nominal rates are going to lead to lower inflation, lower nominal rates now are going to lead to lower inflation now, and that's your neo-Fisherian effect. You can actually make sense of this, but it's not very trivial, okay? Now, Martin Uribe and Stephanie Schmidt-Grohe have a series of papers that say, not only is this possible, we actually see evidence of this in the data, okay? So what gives, I think, is better thought of from the perspective of the Taylor rule than the Fisher equation, because this Taylor rule has to be satisfied at all times. It's still there if that's your understanding of the world, okay? And you're saying the left-hand side of this is going to be permanently lower, right? And the question becomes, well, what changes on the right-hand side such that the Taylor rule is still there, okay? The easier bit to answer is what doesn't change. It cannot be the shock, right? You can't have a infinite sequence of negative shocks that lower the nominal rate. That violates the definition of a shock. So that ain't it, okay? So what can it be? The good candidate here is pi bar, okay? The following argument actually works, and this is what differentiates the neo-Fisherian idea, which seems fishy, from MMT. The neo-Fisherian idea actually has theoretical coherence if you kind of get lucky, okay? So if pi bar is lower, and through a forward-looking Phillips curve, it translates into lower pi, okay? Both steady-state inflation and inflation today have gone down. So the term in those parentheses, that hasn't changed. Both are lower. But if the inflation target, steady-state inflation, is outside the parentheses as well. So pi bar has gone down, IT has gone down, your Taylor rule is satisfied, you're good, okay? This is the good way of thinking about neo-Fisherian disinflation. Now, however, that telling makes it clear that causality really isn't going from lower nominal rates to lower inflation. It goes from a credible reduction in the inflation target to lower nominal rates and inflation. The question then becomes, but imagine that you try to do this the other way around. Imagine that you try to lower the nominal rate, hope that it's going to be signaling a credible reduction in inflation target and inflation, and you fail. Pi bar doesn't go down and pi t doesn't go down. What happens then? That equation still has to be satisfied. There's only one way. It has to be that phi pi is lower. The public perceives that given the inflation differential, you are refusing to respond to inflation. Thus, your rule is unresponsive to inflation differentials. Hence, pi bar is lower. Your Taylor rule is again satisfied, but if you're satisfying it this way and pushing your inflation reaction lower, you're going to run into what every macroeconomist knows as New Keynesian indeterminacy. And then the question becomes, if you're crazy enough to try this, and we're going to argue that we have tried this, right? What exactly happens? What is the observable implication of this indeterminacy? Okay, so we're going to see. But the other question here is, remember, the steady state argument is still there. If I told you that interest rates are going to be permanently lower, it has to be that since the real interest rate is constant at steady state inflation has to be lower. So how is it that I'm not, how are these two things consistent with each other, right? That's the indeterminacy. Under indeterminacy, your expected, in a sense, half-life to steady state is infinity, right? Because you're going to be hopping around in this inflation space every which way because expectations are now self-fulfilling. So the steady state might be preferable, but unlike in a determinate New Keynesian model, there is no well-understood unique path that forces you back to that steady state anymore. So the steady state actually, ceases to be a relevant point of attraction. Okay. So we're going to talk about that monetary policy experiment with this framework, right? And if you are, reading the Turkish press and you had been reading it in the past decade, it will be fairly clear that the government, beginning with the prime minister at the time, who's now the president, has been adamant that interest rates cause inflation, okay? And that's a very good way of teaching correlative versus causation in statistics classes, okay? But here's the point. It was not fiscal tier to price level. It was not fiscal pressures. Debt to GDP, this started in 2010-ish. Debt to GDP at the time was about 40% and was going down. That's not an environment in which a government needs to lean on a central bank for monetization, for fiscal support. It's also the case that, although we don't show it here, it's also the case that the CDS spreads were, by Turkish standards, low and going down. So it wasn't just that things were good. The country was perceived to be better risk than it ever was before. In 2013, Turkey became an investment grade country, right? So that's not the environment in which a government needs to lean on a central bank to help with fiscal problems. Further, something not in the paper, and I apologize for the Turkish title. This is from something that I written years ago, but the central bank fully understood that what they were doing is detrimental to their core mandate. So what you see here, and this is interesting to monetary economists on its own right, the thick black line is the policy rate. The line that looks like the, EKG of someone having a heart attack is the overnight rate, the effective rate, the interbank rate. And then the bands on the corridor, okay? So, towards the beginning of 2010, what you have is, like any other country, you have a policy rate and an effective rate close to the policy rate. Then you see that policy rate being cut, okay, which was bad policy at the time too. And something really bizarre happening to the overnight rate itself. What was happening was the central bank, and these people were not stupid at the time, so they well understood that they were cutting interest rates and this was not going to lead to anything good. So they needed to do something that is restrictive. So they came out and actually announced, we're going to widen the corridor and we're going to let the overnight rate hit both bounds randomly, okay? So essentially they said, we understand that uncertainty is restrictive, so we're going to increase uncertainty because we cannot raise the policy rate, okay? So they tried this for a while, didn't work, as you might imagine. That seems to be a bit too soon. And then did all kinds of other bizarre things. All right, let's move on. So now, then we can ask, right? So given this, really funky policy, are exchange rates random walks, right? Can we think about PPP? And how do we think about commute between exchange rate and inflation, okay? This is what we're trying to understand. And this is what separates Turkey from any other emerging market economy, okay? The dotted blue line is other emerging market economies. The black one is Turkey. On the left, the exchange rate, on the right, inflation, we're special. So we have a bivariate unobserved components model. I'm not going to walk you through it. It's just that, we actually wrote down the models here. But the question we asked was, the unobserved components model is going to decompose inflation and change in the exchange rate into various things, including their trends and shocks to those trends. And we're interested in the correlation of the trend shocks, okay? And that correlation turns out to be 1. It's not about 1, it's 1, okay? So that's your trend PPP. When you have inflation differential that are like this big, obviously they drive, and now I'm making a causal statement that's not in this statistical model, they drive the exchange rate as well, okay? That you see very easily, okay? Now, the sense in which this is easy for us is when we're writing our New Keynesian model, we will not have to worry about writing open economy models, because that tells us that if you nail inflation, you're also getting the exchange rate nails as well, right? We're good. Okay, let me move here. All right, so this is not an easy one to eyeball, but under various models, including this unobserved components model, we try to forecast inflation, including with a random walk, okay? They are not madly different, but if you're willing to do a Diebold-Mariano test, you're gonna find that the unobserved components model that uses inflation to forecast the exchange rate is going to beat the root mean squared error of the random walk, okay? So we do better than me0. This one says, if you try to relate what has been happening to the Turkish monetary policy to various measures of governance, of course you can do it, okay? The lead-lag relationships are not exactly right, because usually things getting bad lead the governance indicators catching up with, things are getting bad, okay? So we try to use the yield spread as a measure to capture the fundamentals. We have some work that bolsters the argument that the yield spread actually is a good measure of Turkish fundamentals rather than, global risk appetite or the US developments, whatnot, okay? And if you're reading this literature, you would be familiar with the Engel and West idea that says, if you think of the exchange rate as an asset price, it's going to be a present value of future fundamentals, and thus it should Granger calls future fundamentals. We show that that's the case, okay? Nice. So then we ask, what the hell? Why was this happening? Why was exchange rate going through the roof? Why was the inflation going through the roof? Okay, so we're going to relate it to the monetary policy rule. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to estimate the Taylor rule. Okay, so we're going to estimate a Taylor rule with all kinds of flexibilities. The inflation target might be time varying. The policy parameter phi pi might be time varying. Okay, and those of you who have thought about this are going to look at this and say, that's not actually econometrically an easy thing to do, because you're going to have all kinds of issues there, kind of right. There are many reasons why those issues might not be all that large, kind of right. There's many reasons why maybe the Turkish case doesn't quite satisfy the conditions under which those problems aren't that large. Happy to talk about these things, okay? But in general, it's a nifty way of implementing a Taylor rule estimation using a Kalman filter. And the middle panel is the answer to the question that you've been thinking about. What the hell was that phi pi in Turkey? Okay, so the solid horizontal line is 0. The dotted horizontal line is 1. Remember, your deterministic condition is more or less that phi pi being 1, right? And it was 1-ish at least, or at least you couldn't reject the null that it was at least 1 until 2010 or so. And then it was no longer 1. And then it was no longer even significantly different from 0. Okay, so now we get to say, given that policy, those outcomes are not very surprising. In fact, pick a group of economists, here you are, and ask them, imagine a country that doesn't raise interest rates as inflation is going up. What would happen to inflation? What would happen to exchange rates? People in general say inflation is going to go through the roof and exchange rates is going to, the local currency is going to depreciate like crazy. But, that's not God's will. That's a statement which is based on a certain understanding of the world, and that understanding is usually based in something like the New Keynesian model. And the question here is, does that model really say that outcome is going to be there? Okay. So this is the model with all kinds of, again, flexibilities. But at the top, you have a IS curve. Below it, you have the Phillips curve. And then there is a Taylor rule. Parameters are moving around. In particular, they are regime shifting, such that in one of the regimes, the Taylor principle is satisfied, in the other one, it is not. What happens? In the regime where the Taylor principle is not satisfied, the dotted blue line, when you get a ding to inflation, you no longer get to control inflation, so it goes through the roof, okay? The problem with this one is it's a symmetric argument. So if you got a negative inflation shock, this time your inflation would be too low. And that's something that we don't see in Turkey or in any country of this sort, right? And why not? Because it's actually not a symmetric problem, right? The problem is that you don't get to raise interest rates. So we introduce the effective upper bound. And the effective upper bound, you can do this with a difference rule too, but this one works good enough for our purposes. Imagine that you're only allowed to raise interest rate to a limit beyond which you don't get to go, okay? What happens? Inflation goes through the roof. Okay, this is no longer symmetric, right? If you were ding on the downside, you can cut interest rates and offset a disinflationary shock. But inflation is going to be not controlled in this world. So very good, okay? And so what this says is, note that we had already seen PPP applies. So if your inflation is going through the roof, your exchange rate is going to go through the roof as well. Thus, this dual observance of inflation was not under control and exchange rates was depreciating like crazy is very consistent through the lens of the new Keynesian model with crappy monetary policy, okay? And so that's the sense in which this paper for academics is a neat observation of what happens under the new Keynesian model with weak monetary policy rules. And for policymakers, it's a very strong precautionary tale that, you know, if you do dinky monetary policy, really terrible things happen, okay? This then, let me skip these because you're going to be yelling at me. Yep. Well, what is, let me show you this. This, cutting the policy rate, that's the black line, and inflation increasing and increasing. That's up to, this is up to the end of 2021. So it's only at 35% at the time, right? But more interesting is as you are cutting the policy rate, again, the black line, the red and the green lines, and those are the 5-year government bond yield and the consumer credit rates. Those are the longer term market rates. Those things are not coming down. They're actually going up, okay? And that also is one of the very basic things with a shifting endpoint new Keynesian model, right? You know, my work 15 years ago with Brian Sack and Eric Swanson and Andy Levin showed that this happened in all kinds of countries. So you see that when you're trying to cut the policy rate in a way that is completely unfounded based on macroeconomic fundamentals, you actually don't get to ease financial conditions because you really, you know, break the financial markets this way, okay? Thus, things to remember, if you're looking for identifying variation for empirical work, take a look at Turkey. Good data in general, right? And sadly, tragically, huge amount of identifying variation. PPP, right there, okay? The new Keynesian model is a great conceptual tool for all kinds of policy questions that we have. Neo-Fisherian disinflation, there is a sense it might work, but if it doesn't, you turn into Turkey, and that's not a pretty thing to be in, okay? So it's a very fishy policy experiment. And this is not, again, specific to Turkey or to emerging markets. That new Keynesian model helps us understand all kinds of economies. And this paper says, if you run your monetary policy in a way that violates basic economics, you're going to end up in a huge mess. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's time for discussion. Edouard, the first.
Great. Thanks to the organizers for having assigned this paper to me. It's a very thought-provoking paper and exciting with lots of material, perhaps a bit too much material. I'll go back to the various points in details. So if there is one picture that you should remember, one chart from the paper, it is this one that shows, you know, inflation and the nominal exchange rate spiraling out of control in the 2010s, and the Turkish central bank not doing anything serious against that. The paper gains a lot from its very clear punchlines. It has very, very good punchlines. So I've picked three, which I think you will like. One is for policymakers. The poor outcomes observed in Turkey contain lessons on how not to conduct policies. Do not do that. That's the counterexample. Second punchline, which is for academics, the dynamics of the Turkish lira exchange rate and inflation in the past decade can be fully explained by standard theory. So I like that one because like many of us, I make a living out of the new Keynesian model, and the new Keynesian model has been heavily criticized in the past decade with lots of puzzles and paradoxes, and we were led to question, maybe it was not such a good model, but yeah, at least it can explain what has happened in Turkey. And the third punchline, which is more for macro theorist, is that one which I really liked, where neo-Fisherian disinflation experiments fail, new Keynesian indeterminacy begins. Okay, so my discussion will be mostly about the second and last punchlines. But before going there, I would like to give some element of context, and that will show why I think this paper is very relevant for us. How do we traditionally evaluate the real impact of monetary policy and test models of the monetary transmissions? Well, we need plausibly exogenous variations in policy. Okay, but variations in what exactly? Much of the empirical literature is about exogenous shocks within a given policy regime. Okay, regime changes are possibly more informative than regular shocks because they are bigger, but they are much less frequent. Okay, so much of our thinking about monetary policy for the US comes from the Volcker shock. And for other countries, we have the adoption of inflation targeting, but there are events that changes in policy regimes are not very frequent. Just to frame ideas, so if you take the example of the US, this is saying that, so this is, I've just fitted an exponential line here. This is inflation for over 40 years, so 20 years before and after the Volcker shock. This is saying you may want to think differently of the before and after. So when inflation, inflation spirals out, and then this inflation takes it, inflation goes back to some mean. You want to think differently from this between this break and the variation that occurs on each side. Okay. Both regime changes and shocks are useful to identify to evaluate theoretical models. So for the US, we have the two classics, Christiano Eichenbaum-Evans on shocks, and we have Clarida Galli-Gertler on regimes, right? The fact that the Taylor principle might or might not be verified before and after the Volcker shock. So the Christiano Eichenbaum-Evans approach has been used in many countries, but it's for the reason that Refet stressed, and I have restated, it's harder to find many regime changes. So this paper is using Turkey as a quasi-natural experiment and brings this evidence on basically the opposite of the Volcker shock. A quasi-natural experiment like this that is rare and fits theory is bound to be widely cited. So I foresee a bright future for this paper. What I like less about the paper is the fact that it's guided by this thread, which is a great thread, but it doesn't have a unified framework. The paper reaches this conclusion using collections of models and approaches, which sometimes are not necessarily mutually consistent, and I think the paper would gain from being streamlined a little. So there is some theory with neo-Fisherism. We have the effective upper bound. We have some reduced from estimation of exchange rate dynamics with a random walk model, with a multivariate unobserved component model. We have a semi-structural estimation of a Taylor rule, and then we have a simulation of a calibrated DSG model with regime changes. And those bits, they all contribute to the final purpose, but they are not completely well articulated with each other. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. In section 2, we have a discussion of the new Fisherian disinflation using a basic Taylor rule. Then in section 5.3, we have an estimation of a Taylor rule with time varying coefficient, which is quite different from the first one. One reason, for example, is that there is a random walk in the real rate. And then we have a simulation of a Taylor rule with a coefficient that follow a mixture of autoregressive and Markov chain process. It's really not clear how the various how the different approaches fit or are consistent with each other. The same is true to some extent of the analysis of the exchange rate. We have a reduced form random walk test of the exchange rate. Then in another section, we have a multivariate unobserved component model. And then in section 5.4, which is about the theory, we have some kind of implicit. So the exchange rate is not explicitly modeled; it's hinted at in a footnote. But presumably, there's going to be some form of uncovered interest rate parity, and we know that it's not enough to explain the behavior of the nominal exchange rate. You may want to add some ingredients, frictions, preferred habitat, whatever. That's going to create deviations from UIP. So there are several issues here. One is that, same as for the Taylor rule, it's not clear how those various pieces fit together. Another issue is that the main point of the paper, I think, is to, from my perspective, is to say, here is a story that fits the theory, and that's great. But I don't know exactly what the first two approaches, which are purely reduced form, how do they relate to the theory? What theory are they testing, validating, or invalidating? For the last one, I would understand, but the last one is very little elaborated upon in the paper. In fact, it's in the background, it's implicit. Because there is a closed economy, the model that is simulated is a closed economy model. So I would, I would have approached the problem differently. I would have specified a small open economy New Keynesian model, look at the implication for the dynamics of the exchange rate, and perhaps estimate that model. It would have been closer to the purpose of the paper, which is to establish the validity of the New Keynesian model in some ways. I have a couple of other comments. Maybe I will just focus on one because I have little time. And this is a point that is valid, I think, in the context of this paper, but in many others paper, in a sense, also in the context of the Clarida-Galli-Gertler analysis. But here the rhetoric is a bit stronger in the paper. The paper argues that failure of the Taylor principle essentially, can explain why prices and the exchange rate are spiraling up. Okay, and that would be a consequence of the indeterminacy of the steady state that occurs when the coefficient in the Taylor rule falls below 1. But indeterminacy is neither necessary nor sufficient for things to spiral. In fact, indeterminacy is a form of excess stability of a dynamic system. It is true that it opens the door to self-fulfilling expectation, but it does not follow that it generates the dynamics that we showed on the graph, the exploding exchange rate. It would take a very peculiar sequence of sunspot shocks to generate that. So just to illustrate this, this is the phase diagram of a simple two-equation New Keynesian model. Okay, so we have the two isocline, the delta pi and the delta y equal to 0, and we have that. So that's the New Keynesian model when the Taylor principle is violated. Okay, so we have a stable branch here and an unstable branch. If the Taylor principle were satisfied, all the arrows would be pointing outwards, and the only equilibrium at every point in time, the only stationary equilibrium, would be the one in the middle. So the economy would jump there. When the Taylor principle is not satisfied, well, you have a stable branch. So in principle, at time zero, you can start anywhere on the stable branch and gradually converge to steady state. So there is more instability in that sense, that when all the arrows are pointing outwards, because we're not jumping right to the middle, we're gradually going to the middle. If there are sunspots, well, sunspot will take you away from the middle. But if you want, so, but this is a picture of convergence. Indeterminacy generates convergence. So the forces are taking you back to the middle. And if you want things to spiral, you need to assume a very particular sequence of sunspot shocks that will gradually take you more and more and more away. So I'm not sure this is really the correct way to think about things spiraling out. Okay, so maybe the story at the end of a binding effective upper bound is more promising, because we know a binding lower bound can cause things to spiral out downwards. So maybe the opposite of that would cause things to spiral up, but that's different from the notion of the traditional notion of steady state indeterminacy. I will stop here. I had a comment on new Fisherism in that paper, but I will skip it.
Okay, thank you, Edouard. So the next discussant is Moritz. Moritz, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper. And thank you to Edouard that he already discussed a lot of the theory. So I can now ask you to like fasten your seatbelt, and then we are going to take a little bit more flight height and look at things from a higher level. And that's what I want to do, and to think mainly about, as someone who is not like earning all his money just thinking about monetary theory, but also thinking about other things. So just thinking a little bit about, having read this paper, like how does it connect between what I see in the data and what I've read in the paper? And there I just have a few. I think it's rather questions than really remarks. So what is this paper actually about? So this was a headline from Bloomberg, September 22nd. Turkey shocks with another rate cut despite raging inflation. So it's really about something that, well, I guess most economists would, every time they hear, think, whoa, what is going on again? So it seems like a big experiment. And in that sense, the paper is, for me, if I teach my undergraduate class, a little bit unfortunate, because yesterday I gave this introduction and explained to students, why do we need models? Well, look, a lot of macroeconomic experiments we cannot do. I cannot call the ECB and say, look, do the following, I want to know what is happening. Okay, and then I had to admit, well, now we have an example. It's actually Turkey, and it's like good for us in terms of theory, because now, exactly as Raphael said, we now have identifying variation, and like now we can actually, we don't have to discuss about the model and whether all the model mechanisms are realistic, because now we can directly compare to data, yet maybe at high costs for people involved. So the general answer is yes, the data actually supports theory. And it's a particular experiment, and Edouard pointed already at this. Like typically, if we look at monetary policy, the only variation that we somehow get is like, in a sense, policy mistakes, so monetary policy shocks, and then we can look at like how the macroeconomy evolves. Whereas here, we really change the entire policy rule. We really change the policy, and that gives us a very different variation that we can study. And in that sense, Turkey helps to verify the model, but as I said, there's potentially very large cost. So what I now want to think a little bit about or ask actually is this link between theory and data. So Rafat also showed these figures on, so this is the exchange rate, the inflation rate, and then we have here all kinds of measures of institutional quality. And I think one thing that I was wondering when looking at this was also a question that Rafat brought up is about identification. So I kind of see that, like, here this is trending down, this is trending down, this is trending down, this is trending up, this is trending up. So, but there's also a lot of variation here in these time series where I would have expected that if this is really something changing in terms of institutions, then shouldn't I also see something in the exchange rate and the inflation rate? So how exactly should I think about this variation really relating to these time series? I see that somehow for many of them, they have potentially the same trend, but also there's a lot of other variation here, for example, around 2015, where I would have expected also to see large jumps in the realized macroeconomic variance. And then I was wondering, okay, well, so how should I really relate theory and evidence? And is it about changes in long run trends or abrupt changes in institutions? So should I think about this policy experiment as a smooth deterioration of institutions, or is it an unexpected shock? Okay, and it comes up again when we think about the policy rule. Like, is that something that we should have seen coming, or is it something that everyone woke up and saw, oh, now things are happening that were very unexpected? And I think in terms of theory, again, and thinking about identification, if I have expectations about some things happening in the future, they should affect already prices and macroeconomic outcomes today. So one question would be, if I take the model and try to back out what would have expectations about institutions or the policy rule have to be such that I can actually match inflation and the exchange rate. So in general, I think going back to this one, there's a lot of variation in all of these time series. Well, is it actually possible to get a tighter link between all the variation that we see here? I understand this is not like, these are not model variables, but somehow the idea is to the entire argument of the paper is somehow that I can relate this to institutional changes, and has there been a large institutional change in 2015, and can I somehow exploit this for validating the theory? And this is also related to one of the model variants that Eduard already discussed. So this is the stochastic process for the policy. But this policy rule has these two stochastic components. So there's regime switching. So randomly, the central bank is changing how it's behaving. Okay, so that can be either switched on or switched off. But if you think about this from a theoretical perspective, it means we should have expected that at some point Turkey is doing what it is actually currently doing. Okay, so it should have been no surprise to us that actually what we currently see happening in Turkey is actually happening. That would be the prediction of the model, that the current situation in Turkey is a non-zero probability event. It always had a positive probability that this is happening, and if not, then it's not exactly clear. Then if you didn't expect this in the past, then it's not exactly clear to me that this is a good description to somehow, or to claim that this is actually the data generating process for what we have seen. So one question would be, can we also maybe back out these deltas here such that we can match the data exactly. Another question that is, again, this is only about the description of the model relative to what we see in the data. So for one of the model assumptions, or one way to rationalize that the model is a good description, is that the situation before the switch must be either described by to be very persistent, or monetary policy strongly pursues a Taylor principle. So this is just a time series of inflation in Turkey. And now looking at this, I was wondering, from looking at this, should I think that the policy was very persistent before or strongly pursuing the Taylor principle? So looking at this data series, what is the more likely situation that we would have seen before? And I think that would be very helpful in providing the reader with some more guidance in like how to think about the connection between theory and data. So I think something I, as a non-insider to this literature, would very much appreciate is to get further guidance and a strengthening link between model and data. That also was the fact with this data series here. It's about the exchange rate and the inflation rate, more or less the two top left figures that I showed you together with the institutions. So this is the linear or the non-linear fit to the data. The two blue lines, like if you had only given me the raw data, the gray fluctuating series here, I would have drawn the blue lines and not the trend. And this is a little bit the discussion about, like, is this a deteriorating institutions over time, or is that a one-time shock? And I think there the paper could be a little bit more precise about how to think about this data series. Is that a one-time jump? We had a one-time jump here around 2012, or is that a smooth transition over time? And I think also it would also be good to make clear whether the changes that we are going to observe are changes on the level. So do we get a steady state shock, or is that something that I should see a different trend? I guess that all of the effects should be on levels, but sometimes I was not, especially when I saw this, I was not exactly sure whether the paper now suggests that this is a prediction of theory, or whether theory actually predicts that we are going to see rising and rising exchange rates over time. So in summary, it was really a great paper, especially for someone like me to read, because I learned again a lot about monetary policy. It actually is a fantastic paper for economics in general and for economic theory, because it just demonstrates the importance of having economic theory. And what is even nicer is that it also supports what we have used in terms of economic frameworks in the past to think exactly about the questions. I think in terms of feedback, I think the discussion tends to be from time to time a little bit suggestive, and we all want to believe what is written, but I think maybe sometimes it could be, it could try to strengthen the link between the data and the theoretical discussion. I very much enjoyed it, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss it here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Moritz. It's time for questions. Otherwise, you can start answering. Yeah, Ricardo, you have a question?
So this is a really great paper, and I very much enjoyed reading it. I wanted to make one question that was, maybe I got confused with Eduard's discussion, and then one suggestion. So, I mean, we have if we have a model with indeterminacy, like Eduard noted, then that doesn't mean more stability or instability. It just means, well, indeterminacy, which is hard. But I thought that what you did, Rafed, and that's why I need a clarification, was instead to say, when you took the status, let's have a regime switching where there's an indeterminacy range and a determinacy range, and I switch into it. Therefore, there's no longer indeterminacy. It is determinate. That's why you're able to solve it. And in that case, violating the Taylor principle in one of the regimes leads to spirals that explode, as in the work that has done this, starting with my student Francesco Bianchi and many others 10, 15 years ago. So I just want to clarify if that's what happened, and that's why you mean that indeterminacy means spiral. It's indeterminacy in a regime, but indeterminate model because you switch into another regime where things get determined. And I just got confused about that, if that's what's going on. Second, and a question now to you, Rafet, is when you talk about the effective upper bound, I didn't understand neither in the paper nor in your presentation whether there was actually a policy or your interpretation of a policy. Because if it was a policy, then great, because we do have experience of effective upper bounds having been implemented. Most famously, the US between 1946 and 49, the UK during the Radcliffe regime in the 50s and 60s, and ended up with behaviors of inflation very similar to the ones you're seeing in Turkey, indeed, which is as you put an effective upper bound on interest rates, you say, I'm not going to raise them above a certain level. You see inflation spiraling and exchanges moving similar to what you're finding. So if this was an explicit policy, then great, because then it's now a third data point matching something. But I didn't quite understand if it was an explicit policy or implicit or just a modeling device for what was going on. So if you could clarify. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Moritz?
Thanks, Moritz Schillerich. As usual, Ricardo was faster than I am, so I wanted to also ask about the effective upper bound. And thanks for the great paper, by the way, to you and all the co-authors. Really enjoyed it. So I also had these historical parallels in mind, and wanted to tease you or like ask you to what extent you would even see what we're seeing right now in the world as a potentially related to an implicit effective upper bound, not just in Turkey, but maybe also like extend your thoughts a little bit beyond. And what could these effective upper bounds be? Financial stability concerns, etc. I mean, could there be something that markets actually anticipate, not just, I know there's a paper about Turkey, but, I know you think about the world globally. So I wanted to tease you a little bit. The other question I have, it sounds a little bit esoteric maybe, but there are more and more papers that I see, and they get more and more credible, and at least more and more like less sort of strange at the first sight, that talk about how I might affect R. So how the monetary policy might have an effect on the natural rate. Is that anything that you would contemplate in any scenario? Maybe again, not just in the Turkish case, but more broadly speaking, how should we think about a potential role that how monetary policy could actually affect the natural rate as well? Because that's obviously something you take as given, but maybe I move that around as well. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Nicola Limodio from Bocconi. I have a question about the kind of the underlying mechanism that was behind it, and basically the interbank market and the banking system. There wasn't much of a presentation about that, but it would be interesting to understand how the banking system reacted to basically this combination of high inflation, low rates, and lack of balance in the balance sheet of banks. I mean, that would change completely the risk taking that the system has, the role of equity. And I mean, it would be nice to have some, when you show the policy rate and the corridor, I mean, that tells us a story about risk and the cardiac lines that you were mentioning. So it would be nice to know.
Okay, thank you. So you have time to answer questions and remarks.
Well, thanks for the discussions. I thought both were very well taken, and thanks for the comments and questions. Let me begin by what I've learned is something that I have to say every time I present this paper. It's a paper, not a book. So a lot of these questions have to do with things that are truly fascinating, and indeed, I'm very, beyond delighted to see that the message gets across correctly that this is not a paper about Turkey and you all get this. Very good. But obviously, one of the places where a country that does, monetary policy this way, you're very correct in thinking that, something very interesting must be going on the banking and the interbank market and the credit allocation too. Sure, right? But we didn't want to show that into this paper as well. So we can talk about this, but what happens is, especially in the much more recent experience, private banks in particular are trying to do the right thing, meaning they're trying to shrink, and the government is using a heavy stick to not to let them do that. And we see the outcomes of that. And monetary policy transmission in 2022 now actually is essentially non-existent because there are so many constraints on who gets credits, under what terms, whether they're allowed to buy foreign currency with it, whatnot, that normally you would have expected that cutting interest rates today would have done a lot in the markets. Nothing, right? Because starting from the fall of 2021, you began to nip markets every which way to make sure that the fallout isn't as obvious. Now, on the discussions, once again, very good, all well taken. Edward is very correct that we're using a kind of mixed bag of methods. That's a feature, not a bug. We really wanted this to be, you can use this experiment to look at PPP. And if you wanted to do that, this is how you do it. Now, it is of course feasible, it would be an entirely different paper, to do it in one huge model that is correctly tying all of these pieces together. But if you just wanted to be understanding the PPP part of it, you would have to understand all of it. We really wanted this to be sufficiently modular in the sense that you wanted to look at PPP, you only need to understand the PPP bit. You want to understand the New Keynesian bit, you only need to understand that bit. So for every question, we went to the minimal setting that allowed us to answer that question. Various people noted, again, correctly, obviously, that indeterminacy doesn't mean spiraling up through, right? That's why we are kind of more fond of the effective upper bound model. And Ricardo is obviously correct in noting that there is no way of showing these impulse responses in a model that is actually indeterminate because the outcomes would be indeterminate, right? So you have to rig the model such that globally it's determinate, right? And only in a certain regime, this is why we don't call it the indeterminate regime, but call it the weak regime, right? If that regime were to be sufficiently persistent, then the model would be indeterminate. Then I wouldn't be able to say anything. So the weak regime has to be A, low enough probability, and B, the strong regime has to, impose sufficient determinacy that overall the whole thing is determinate. Okay, so that's how this works. Thus, there was another bit. So the comment on this regime should therefore have been foreseen with some probability. We think of it the other way around. Starting from here, the other regime has to be foreseen with sufficient probability, such that people are still willing to hold the Turkish lira, right? Otherwise, why would anyone do this? Okay, so we agree with you, but it's that you unexpectedly find yourself in this bizarre world. You have to be attributing sufficient probability that at some point we're going to do the same thing, and that is why we're able to live in the country with a functioning monetary, sphere to some extent. Okay, I'm not going to go over this, item by item and respond to every which bit, but yes. So the model is determinate. The effective upper bound, it's not a law, right? In the legal sense, the central bank is still independent, pursuing price stability mandate, whatnot. But we've had 4 central bankers in a span of 2 years, one of whom was removed from office after raising interest rates with the sentence, "The guy wouldn't listen." Okay, and looking at that, I don't actually see a very implicit effective upper bound. Okay, it's not legally there, but it's very explicit. So I think that's good enough for my purposes. On Morris's point, again, the same for the upper bound. The nominal rate affecting the real rate, you're obviously talking about the long run real rate. That's a good point. But again, you need a decently functioning economy such that a lower nominal rate today actually lowers the real rate today, right? Fosters investments, and that has either a hysteresis effect or some, long run dynamics that works with that. Some of that perhaps is there, not going to make a statement on whether that idea in general is correct. But if you're doing monetary policy in a way that breaks the whole thing, right, it doesn't move in the right direction. It doesn't move in the right direction because remember, that idea begins from the observation that lower interest rates today, are good in a sense, and that goodness is self-propagating. Breaking the whole thing isn't really good, and that doesn't lead to a propagation of anything good either. No. Okay, so once again, thank you very much for the nice reception and the comments and the questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to all of you. Now we have a break, and for 4:30 there is a session with Ricardo on the panel. So I think there is coffee just on the other side of the wall.